Everyone, and welcome to our workshop today on performing workplace violence threat assessments using the WAVR21 methodology. I'm Justina Duco, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm a marketing specialist here at Resolver. Our leaders of today's session will be Dr. Stephen White. He is president of WTS Incorporated and co-author of the WAVR21 methodology. And joining him will be Margaret McKee, our manager of solution engineering at Resolver. So today's session will actually be an open dialogue between Dr. White and Margaret. They'll be walking us through a sample case that outlines the steps required for threat assessment using the WAVR21 methodology inside of Resolver's WAVR21 app. So the goal of today's session is that you'll walk away with some practical tactics on how to identify threats in your organization immediately following today's workshop. And just before I pass it off here to our speakers, I do want to note that we will have some time at the end of the session to walk through some questions. So if you do have any throughout the workshop, please submit them at the Q&A icon or section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end and answer them live. And we'll also be recording today's session, and we'll be sending you the full recording following the workshop in the next day or two. So keep an eye out in your inbox. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to you, Dr. White.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I want to say a few opening words about threat assessment per se, something that I've been practicing since the late 1980s. And it's a very thoughtful, deliberate process. It's dynamic and ongoing. It involves assessing not just if someone is dangerous or not, but what is the nature of the risk and the severity of targeted or planned predatory violence. We do this initially and ongoing, as we'll see in the case example. And then along the way, as we're assessing someone or a context, we consider different strategies to prevent harm, as well as to redirect focus for non-risk situations. And inevitably, any of you will understand this who are doing cases, we're managing the fear and disruption that is involved in cases very typically, regardless of the level of risk. Now, threat assessment is a multidisciplinary practice. There's HR people, security people, specialists in assessment, law enforcement at times, employment attorneys and other legal professionals. All of them have a part of the mix. And this is all based on over 35 years of research and extensive case experience. It's now widely recognized as the way to go about assessing these risks in organizational context and recommended by many professional departments and panels. Now, the WAVR21 is an example of what's known as a structured professional judgment guide. And SPJs are tools used by practitioners at all levels of competence and training to assess violence risk in different populations of concern. The risk factors in a tool are evidence-based. They reflect the state of the science, best practices. There are specialized SPJs for, let's say, sex offenders or domestic abuse, inpatient considerations, adolescents, and the waiver, of course, is for workplace and campus context. Now, importantly, no tool is magic and going to give you all the answers. And with some algorithm, you combine the data generated by an SPJ with your professional or clinical judgment, staying in your lane in terms of your level of competence and training. It's a good idea to remember the mantra of when in doubt, confer, but you use the data from the tool with your judgment to make the very challenging intervention decisions, recognizing we can make a decision that may have an unintended consequence. So there's lots of thinking and consideration of how we respond to these matters.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. White. I'll pass it off to you now, Margaret.
Hi, everyone. Here we'll get started with our WAVR21 summary grid. We can see here that there's 21 fundamental risk factors, which we are going to dive deeper into throughout the next half an hour. This grid is completely blank in terms of coding, meaning that we actually haven't started our assessment process just yet. At the end of this webinar, we will be able to see how it's fully complete based off the WAVR21 methodology that we'll review today.
Just glancing at those, you can see that there a lot of them make perfect sense. They're common sense. There are 19 risk factors and one protective factor. That's the good news in a case, the indicators that suggest someone is not going to engage in violence. And then finally, we have a number 21 is how we assess the amount of disruption in a situation. It's not a risk factor per se, but an important bit of case information. Okay.
Perfect. From here, we'll take a look at the intake of each of these particular cases.
So I've adapted a case here. I've kept it fairly simple. And again, you know, we can talk about all the different aspects of a case and different opinions or what directions to go. But just to demonstrate how the app works, here's the situation. And this is based on a case that I had, where an individual sent anonymously an email to a business magazine criticizing the magazine for listing his former company as the best place to work. And what he said in the email, which is entered into the intake or reporting summary, this is the first data that comes in to the organization. The magazine contacted the company. The waiver intake person entered this in the incident report. And the subject's email said, I was laid off from Acme Corp due to this pandemic. In this economy, my best alternative to continue to support my 5 children and stay-at-home wife seems to be suicide to get them my life insurance. We were living from paycheck to paycheck with no savings, home equity, or 401k balance. I am 58 and with serious health problems, and I know my boss was looking for an excuse to get rid of me. I hope he dies from the virus. A company that does this to sweet innocent children does not belong on any best places to work list. Please do your research more carefully. I'm a God-believing man who does not believe in violent solutions. I do, however, understand why a person would go back to work with a gun, kill himself, and even his family. Remember that legal consequences have no meaning when your life is ending. Now, it's not rocket psychology to see that this is a concerning email. And now we can show how we enter information. In the intake form, it includes a lot of demographic information, descriptors of the individual, as well as inquiry questions. But first, there's a quick list of 5 indicators that a user can check off that are basically sort of red flags on an intake of a case. So, threats or expressed ideas, yes, that's present. Are there behavior that cause concern? Well, the behavior of writing this and being public with it is a concerning behavior in itself. Does the subject have access to weapons or is attempting to gain access? We don't know, so we're unsure of that. And by the way, we're not discriminating against people who have firearms. It's about having access to a weapon in a troubled context. So then the next one is bizarre thinking or distinctly irrational suspiciousness. These are where acute mental symptoms with violent content may play a part. I would say in this actually unsure, because I don't get that from this email, but there's so much that we don't know from this first email, of course. There's always more we would like to know. So we're unsure there, but what this shows is what we'd like to know as well. And are there circumstances or triggering events, as we often call them, that would affect the likelihood of violence? And I've indicated here, yes, because as this person continues and has no economic support, things are going to get worse for him and his family. Now, priority level is also a useful indicator on the waiver and the Resolver app, because this shows us quite straightforward how quickly do we need to act on this. It's not the same as, is it a high level of risk? We don't know what the risk is, but we have a high level of concern. And this is something that we really need to deal with very quickly. We don't know what the fellow has in mind. So we've marked it as high priority, meaning, and we have definitions of this, is that the team should convene promptly and discuss the matter.
From here, we can open this case fully and we'll take a look at our chronology and action plan today. within an open case.
Now, a very helpful aspect of the Resolver app is the chronology. You know, when we're doing cases, I'm sure many of you would agree, we're always trying to keep track of who did what, on what date, and what was the result and all of that. A timeline of events, what the subject of concern did, how we responded, where is that information? And a chronology captures all of that. And the first actions were the team convened, renewed the initial information, and then took further steps. And these are date stamped, and the author of who entered it can put their name in there as well.
We can see the workflow states. So if an action was not completed on time, the software can move it into an overdue state that allows it to automatically follow up with the owner in charge of this particular action and make sure it's completed in a timely manner here.
You can see how valuable that is, so that things don't fall through the cracks, which is a process issue with case management. So here's the larger chronology and actions taken. And you can see how started on the 28th of April, goes down to May 1st. And these are the actions taken. The team convened. They tried to figure out who this was, and it was a fairly small company. So with some inquiries with different managers and HR people, they had a pretty good idea. I think it sounds like this fellow that we knew, and that was pretty much confirmed. And then a decision was made to gather, of course, more information and to try to engage with the individual. There's always pros and cons to that. But first, the line manager of that individual who told the team he was pretty sure who this was. Then he was interviewed by a team representative, which can, of course, be entered in the database. And what the former supervisor had to say about the employee was that he was, quote, generally kind of a complainer, but not angry or aggressive. He was a so-so performer. He got along with most people. He never made any threats. I don't know about any firearms. He seemed to have family and financial stressors. And of course, this is a summary. It could be a lot of information that was entered here in a lengthy interview. So that's a bit of collateral data that was gathered. And then an HR person did reach out, a person on the team who was skilled in threat assessment practices, and contacted the employee and said, hey, we're wondering if you might have written this email that was sent to us. And he said, well, yes, I did write it. He said, well, would you mind talking to us more about it? It's not a confrontive interview. That's a judgment about how to engage with somebody, whether to be confrontive or empathic and just listen. And many people will talk about what their grievance is. So a longer meeting was held, and this is what this is a virtual meeting, of course, in these days, and this is what occurred. The HR pro had this virtual meeting. He restated his complaints, his perspective on his circumstances. The interviewer was empathic, not accusatory. Doesn't mean you minimize the seriousness of making a veiled threat, but and then ask eventually waiver-related questions that have to do with the 21 factors, including risk of lethality. Well, do you have any thoughts to hurt yourself or hurt others, etc.? Have you ever hurt anyone? I know it was hard you lost your job, but do you think about the future, or are you just still dwelling on losing that job? How important was that job to you? By the way, all the people who were laid off in this did get a package, but it wasn't enough. It rarely is enough, especially in these days. But this is not an uncommon scenario in a reduction in force. So there's an inquiry there. And then the team member says, well, by the way, would you meet with another member or our expert who works with our team who would also engage with you? And he agreed to. These are all good signs, in our opinion, at this point. The individual is willing to talk and is responding to various diffusing methods. It could have gone completely different, and then we might be in a tactical situation. So again, we're just showing you how the app works. Okay, so Yes, Margaret,
I
go
was
ahead.
just going to say, as we progress through some of these conversations with all the involved parties, we can make sure to update this intake and documentation questionnaire, giving a bit more context to the case at hand based off some of the information that we're collecting here.
And the only point I want to make about this form, the intake and documentation form, is you can get a lot of information in this. You're not coding or making judgments about risk level, but gathering information that then can be transferred to the waiver worksheet, which is really the heart of the waiver, in which we're going to show you next. But this is sort of an investigative tool here to gather risk-related information. Okay?
And as we visit one of those worksheets, as we're working our way through this case, what we'll take a look at is a grid that's half complete. So we only know some of the factors, and we'll be able to see that now we've went from a completely blank grid to some areas that are marked present here.
Yeah, so if I go down this list here, and Marty, you can show number 1 as well, which is motives for violence. I don't know if this individual actually has a motive for violence. Threats can mean lots of things. And a motive is something we figure out. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes not. But number 2, homicidal fantasies and violent preoccupations, that is present. And I'm going to show you how we code that. But first, if we just scroll down here, yes, he made threats. That's item number 3. The others, 4, 5, and 6, invalid basically means insufficient information. We don't know. But what the waiver and SPJ show you is a map of what you'd like to know that's evidence-based, okay? So these are the indicators we'd like to know more about. If possible, he does have a current job problem, number 7, and he was extremely attached to the job, and that's present. And of course, these codings are absent, present, prominent. We'll talk about that in a minute. And these are judgment calls here based on what you know at a given time. So then there's other items there, but let's show how we code number 2, okay?
So as we go to open up each of our 21 factors, we will see a brief description and be able to fully walk through coding, which Dr. White will do here.
Now, there's the date again, it's present, the source date, and then the coding notes. And it's just what we've already talked about. The subject originally stated a violent fantasy in an email to a magazine. Although he does not believe in violent solutions, he does understand why someone would go back to work and act violently. He acknowledged he had those thoughts, but he would never act on them. He knows his family would be worse off. That's entered in another item, but the fantasy is there. Now, if we look at the coding, this is where we really get into the value of the waiver and the app. Okay, for each of the items, there is a coding definition of absent, present, or prominent. Absent means we have investigated enough, so we are very confident it is absent. It's not the same as insufficient, but it basically says there's no evident violent ideas for number 2. We marked it present, saying their violent or homicidal ideas are present. They're not resisted. Prominent, we say, for the worst cases where the individual is obsessed and immersed in violent ideas, may identify with violent perpetrators. It's a very strong mental pattern. And let me say, any item you look at in the context of what you know about the other items. So you're doing integrating. Now notice here, item definition, and this is taken from the larger waiver manual, which you get with the app. And each section dealing with the item first asks the key question, does the person have preoccupation with violent ideas? And then the risk indicators, which is just a statement of what's in that item. Person does have these ideas. And then there's text, 2 to 4 pages for each item, discussing the research and clinical evidence for a relationship of that item to actual violent risk. And then that section finishes up with relevant inquiry questions for investigators. So you can see immediately you can go to the manual from the worksheet to find more information about that particular item, which is a very good way to learn threat assessment, because with cases, you see an item and then you dig into the knowledge base about it. Makes it very efficient that way. Okay, so that's how you would code an item, and coding can change. Threat assessment is dynamic. Opinions have a short shelf life. Some are more stable than others. There's many false positives, but it all depends. Now, at the end of the worksheet, we have a place for the narrative, risk opinion narrative. And we've broken it down. And assessors, including yourselves, who are giving opinions, updating opinions, or someone like me who may give a very formal opinion with a verbal or written report, should be including these kinds of points to address. What's the likelihood the subject will act violently toward any members of the organization? I just said here, very little likelihood to harm members. However, cannot entirely dismiss the possible risk to his family. Now, let me say, I wrote these in. One thing we didn't say is a more experienced person did meet with the person, developed more of the information about whether or not he posed a risk or not, helped him get redirected to some voc rehab, some more support from HR, including some short financial support. And all of that's, he responded to all of that, and then that is entered into the narrative, which I could have written much longer here. But ultimately, the opinion was, I don't think he's going to hurt anybody, but we should monitor it. It's possible that there could be a suicide risk. That's what he stated originally. He said he would never do that. He repeated he would never do that. He mainly wanted attention and to have someone to talk to about all of this. This could be a situation where there was risk to the family. We'd have to involve outside resources for that. That's called an altruistic homicide suicide. People will actually kill their family members to spare them misery. May be hard for you and me to understand, but with threat assessment, we're understanding a lot of things that are very alien to us and trying to not let those things happen. So then obviously we mentioned the steps that could be taken to manage the individual. In this case, it's more about support. What might make it worse? If we did nothing, it would get worse. If we forgot about it. So we stay engaged with the individual, we monitor, we do what's reasonable. We're not letting people hold us hostage by threatening us. Those are some of the issues that obviously get discussed in any case. And then opinions and recommendations all along the way, whether you're a professional evaluator like myself, or someone like yourselves who may be on in-house threat assessment teams. And then the level of concern at any particular point is entered also into this narrative.
The last thing we'll take a look at before we wrap up this half hour is really the outcome of that coding grid that we viewed at the beginning of this workshop. So we will note that it's completely filled out based off the requirements and the codes that we went through.
So you can see what I marked as absent, what are still present. And again, this assumes there was a very thorough assessment and on more than one occasion. So we have a pattern that's consistent. Now notice number 8, for instance. Now his extreme job attachment is absent because he was able to let go of that and begin to think about and work on the future, a next job. So the waiver allows you to indicate and code minor de-escalation or major de-escalation or escalation. Are things getting worse? Are things getting better? Or is there no change? So you can see how that's coded here on several of these items. And some of you with experience are saying, well, Dr. White, I think I'd disagree with you on number 10. I think this guy's entitled. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. And that's what we would discuss in a case management meeting, is different opinions of people who have different experience and perspectives on a case. That's the process. What the waiver does and the app does is keep you organized on evidence-based factors so that you stay on the map. There may be external factors that are unique to a case, and those can also be entered. There's not a rigidity there where you only look at these. Context is very important. But anyway, you can see how we filled out the grid summary, and this is transferred from the fuller worksheet. But it's good to have just this one-page summary on the grid. It's very helpful, especially if you're trying to educate more senior managers who are wondering, how are you making these decisions? Well, we're using an evidence-based tool. Here's our app. Here's our information. It's all easy to see and organized nicely, and very helpful in that regard.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Dr. White, and thank you to Margaret. At this time, I'll open up the floor for some questions. We don't have any right now. I'll give you a couple of seconds to enter any if you do have some. Otherwise, what I can do is just start wrapping up, and I'll let you know if we have any that come in. Okay. Thank you to everyone for joining us on today's session. Thank you to our speakers, Dr. White and Margaret, for sharing your expertise with us. I hope you all gained some great value out of how to identify threats within your own organization, and how to perform threat assessments using the WAVR21 methodology. And just a reminder that I will be sending around the recording from today's session, as well as the slide deck, so you can share it around with your team or review it later on. We do have one question pop in here. Let me see. Mm-hmm. Oh, and they ask, can we obtain a copy of the presentation slides? So yes, we will be sending those. Keep an eye on your inbox. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you everyone. And on that note, I'll save you a couple of minutes in your day. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And on behalf of Resolver and WTS Incorporated, thank you all for joining us, and stay safe and healthy.
Thanks very much, folks.